Hello and welcome to an AppTec presentation video. In this video we will give you an overview over the console as a whole and on a few example operating systems to give you a general overview over the system, what you can do, what you should know, and where you can find all the different functions. This should give you a good overview what the system can do, and if you start testing, this will give you a good start because you will know where you will find things and what you should do first, or maybe you don't need to do, and all this kind of stuff. To do this, I'm already here in the console. This is where you begin after setting up the on-premise machine or logging into our cloud account. If you create a cloud account for testing, for example, this is where you will start, but we will leave this section for now for a bit later and start with the general settings, where we can go to in the bottom left. In the general settings, this is where we can find, well, general settings. So a lot of basic configuration stuff that affects all the devices, the whole console and all this kind of things. A lot of first time configurations where you configure certain functions for the first time so you can use them forever. So a lot of things here where you will spend a lot of time or a bit of time at the beginning, but in the long run you will rarely look into these sections, most likely. This begins with the account overview, where you can see a lot of information about your own account. Overall, a lot of information you're already aware of, so nothing too fancy here. The most interesting thing is a short overview over the amount of device license you currently are allowed to have, or the maximum number of device licenses, and the amount of licenses you currently use. So in my case, I see, okay, if I get 10 new devices, there's enough room. I don't have to think about licenses, and I can just enroll the devices. Or the other way around, I notice, okay, I have not enough licenses and I have to buy more of them. Another thing, depending on if you're using it in the cloud or on-premise, is the software version. Depending on where you are using the system, this may be more or less important. In case of the cloud, the updates will be installed automatically, so you don't have to think about it, and you maybe just look up, okay, what has changed in this version. And on-premise, of course, you have to be sure to keep the system up to date. So in this case, the software version may be more important to you. If you're running on-premise here and you maybe are outdated, short info will be displayed here that you are outdated, as well as in the top right. So yeah, but besides that, a lot of information you highly likely already know. In manuals and FAQ, we have a few links to the administration manual in English and German, and a link to our YouTube channel where you can find a few video tutorials, like for example this video here. In the bug report, you can send a bug report. This is pretty simple. You fill, if you have any problems, any errors, any bugs, you fill this out and send it to us and we can look into it. You can also send in feature requests, which is very important to us because this is something we really look into and we really gather the information from it and maybe ask questions if something is not clear. So if you have anything that could be better or a new feature you wish for, just fill this out with as much information as possible and a short example, for example. And we will take this on our roadmap depending on how many and how often something gets requested. Generally, with the system, you can record GPS data of the devices. If you are going to record GPS data of your devices, you are able to set here 1 or 2 passwords to protect this GPS data. So for example, if you need GPS, or you can set a password and one password goes to your IT administrator, the other, or CEO, or whoever it is, the other password goes to someone else, for example, a data protection officer or whatever. And only if both people come together to one PC and enter both their passwords, you can access the GPS data of a device, and otherwise no one can access it. So your GPS data, if you record it, is safe until you really need it. In the role-based access, you can define different roles. These roles define who can log into the system and what they can do. So for example, if you look into here, you can really every part of the console, you can either allow a role to only see it or to access it and change it. So you can do something like the data protection officer, who can only see things and not change things. or you can also do, I don't know, some kind of some kind of location admin where you say, okay, for this location, we have a separate IT admin. He manages the devices of this location, and you create a special role for him so you can only see his group and their devices and nothing else in the console. And yeah, you can just do whatever you want here with the roles if you want such a limited access in the MDM. In the Apple configuration, we have something that is very important, even though it is just a very small task when looking at the time you need for it. The APNS certificate. The APNS certificate is something that is required server-wise, server-side, so we can communicate with Apple's push system and communicate with the devices. So in other words, you just have to set this up before you can use Apple devices. This is very easy. It's explained in a few steps here. It's explained in the manual, so it's nothing hard to do. It's really something you just need 1 or 2 minutes. Nothing too fancy. That's why I won't go into detail here. It's really easy. The other thing why I want to mention this part is another part of it which sometimes people forget. Because as you can see, the APNS certificate is only valid for 1 year, and you have to renew it before it expires. Should it expire, you will lose the connection to all your Apple devices and you have to re-enroll them manually, and depending on the situation, this would mean you have to reset them. So really make sure you do not miss this date. You can renew the certificate 1 month before it expires, or even 6 months. That's no problem. But if you do it too late, this will be a problem. So just keep this in mind. Apple will send you a reminder. We will send you a reminder. We will show a reminder in the top right. But all this does not help you if, for example, the mail address changes, or for example, you're out of the office or whatever. So make sure to maybe make your own calendar entry to make sure you do not forget this. Maybe make one month before it expires and make it as soon as possible, because this can be very annoying if you forget this. Another thing that's important to know is which Apple ID to use to create this. You can technically do this with every Apple ID, but the problem is you need the exact same one to renew it, of course. So make sure to use some kind of generic Apple ID, something like IT at your company name or whatever, and document the login credentials. So for example, a colleague or someone who's coming after you quit can access this account and renew it, because if you lose access to this account, or someone has to renew it and doesn't have the access, it's not possible. So make sure to keep this in mind. Otherwise, as I said, this is something you create at the beginning. Afterwards, you can start enrolling Apple devices and don't have to think about this for around 1 year. Another thing I want to mention here is the connection to DEP. You are also able to use DEP, the Device Enrollment Program, with our system. The idea of DEP is basically pretty simple and pretty good. The idea is that you buy the devices from a vendor that supports it. That's important. Not every vendor supports it, so make sure to communicate with your vendor before you purchase devices. And afterwards, the vendor will register devices in the Apple Business Manager on your account. This is connected with our MDM system and allows us to get information about the devices and give out information for the devices, so the devices know what they have to do and what they should do and where to go. So if you do this, if you configure this and buy your devices, for example, all the synchronization and registration stuff happens in the background while the devices are being packed and shipped to you. And after they are shipped to you, you get them out of the box, active and turn them on, connect them to the internet, and when they connect to the Apple server for the first time registration, they will get the information to what they should do and which MDM they should contact, and the device will enroll itself completely automatically. You don't have to scan anything, you don't have to enter anything, you have the option to skip all the setup steps. So you basically just have to take the device out of the box, turn it on, connect to a Wi-Fi or enter a SIM card, and everything's done. That's the general idea of DEP. A pretty nice to have thing. It's nothing you have to use. If you, for example, cannot use DEP because of your Windows doesn't support it, or whatever the reason might be, that's not a huge deal. But if you can use DEP, you should of course use it, because it makes your life much easier. You can do the same not only with the business manager, I just mentioned the business manager, but you can also connect a school manager account. This is currently not set up in my case, but you can do the same thing with the school manager. This behaves basically the same thing in regards of DEP, but in addition to DEP with the school manager, you can also import classes and students and configure the classroom app and other school related apps. In configurator and URL, you can find some stuff that's related to the configurator. That's only really interesting to you if you want to enroll the devices if you want to enroll iOS devices as managed devices. We will talk about that topic later. And if you are not able or you don't want to use DEP, then the Apple configurator is your alternative. That's quite easy, so I don't go into very much detail here. It's explained in the manual, but it's basically you can enroll the devices via the Apple configurator, which is a software you get on macOS, and and when you're doing that, it's quite easy. You just have to provide a URL, which you can get here. You just select the devices in the configurator, say you want to make them ready and enroll them, and then it will ask you for an URL, which you can get here. But we will talk about the configurator and why you might need it a bit later. In the Android configuration, we'll find some basic Android configurations. One of the things I want to mention here is the uninstall protection. We recommend to enable the uninstall protection, not for the uninstall protection itself, but as you can see, for the uninstall password, which only is enabled if the uninstall protection is set. The uninstall protection is not really necessary on most modern Android devices, but as I said, it enables the uninstall password, and this can be quite interesting. To keep it short, you want to set a password here because this offers a backdoor on Android devices for you as an admin if something could go wrong. Just in the way how Android works, there could be certain errors, certain problems, technical issues that basically prevent you from accessing the device from the MDM server, so it is not able to connect to the MDM server, and maybe you forbid every way of resetting the device. In this case, the uninstall password is your backdoor, so you should set this. If you don't need it, it will not hurt you. It doesn't have any downsides or something like this, but if you need it, it's very rare that you will need it, but if you need it, you will be happy if you set a password here. Then I will talk about Android Enterprise. I try to keep this very simple because Android Enterprise is a pretty broad topic which combines many different things, many different technologies. There will be a more detailed video about this on our YouTube channel. So check this out for every detailed information you need. But I will keep this short and try to explain this as simple as possible. As said, Android Enterprise can seem very complex and very complicated because it combines so many different things, but generally it's quite easy to use. To use Android Enterprise, you simply have to connect on a Google account. This Google account doesn't have to be anything special. You don't need any G Suite or Google Workspace or anything like this. This can be a fresh generated Google account. It doesn't really need to be or have anything. We also recommend doing this with a normal Google account. And to connect this, I already did this in my case, but it's basically just clicking on a button, log in with your Google account, and it's connected. After connecting the Google account, you can access every Android Enterprise feature. What is Android Enterprise, or what are the Android Enterprise features? There are 3 different modes as of now, which you can use with Android Enterprise. One of them being a bring your own device container. So for example, if people bring their own private device and you want to give them work data on the device, but keep it separate from the private data, this is what you want to do. Android Enterprise bring your own device container is the way to go. The other mode is the exact opposite. If you have a company device that should only be used for company purposes and only contain company data, then there is the Android Enterprise Device Owner mode, or fully managed mode, as called. And this gives you full control over the device, where you can basically control almost everything. This is what you want if you have mainly company devices. And the third mode basically combines both things a bit. As I said before, the bring your own device container is mainly for people who bring their own private device. But there could also be a scenario where you as a company offer the device to the users, but you want to allow them to use the device privately. So you also want a container to separate the data. And this is where the enhanced work profile comes into place. Enhanced work profile basically combines both things I just mentioned. You will have still some kind of control over the device, but also have a container on the device which is separate from the private data. Their main difference is basically on a private device with the bring your own device container. Since it is a private device, the user can always remove the MDM and always remove the container. But this is highly likely something you do not want on a company device, because if the user would be able to remove the MDM and the container, you would not be able to get any info from the device, and it just looks like stolen or lost to you. So that's the main difference. The people cannot remove the container and the MDM so easily, and you still have a little bit of control over the device. But yeah, that's the three main modes for Android Enterprise. Another thing I want to shortly mention, because there's just some misunderstandings out there. We sometimes hear from customers two things. No, Android Enterprise doesn't cost money. It doesn't cost money on our end. It does not cost money on Google's end. It's free, completely free. You don't have to pay anything. Like I said, you just need a simple normal Google account. That's all. Another thing is, no, you do not need any special devices for it to use it. There's a common misconception about that as well. Android Enterprise basically works for most devices. Of course, we are talking about Android, so developers or manufacturers can remove support for it in any way. But generally, for the most devices you can just normally buy in a store or online, they will support Android Enterprise. If there are exceptions, it's most likely special manufactured devices for some kind of industrial use or something like this. So in such cases, talk to the manufacturer to make sure. Otherwise, if it's a normal device you can normally buy, it will support Android Enterprise. But that's about Android Enterprise for now. No, not for now. We have a short thing we can already talk about, is how you enroll Android Enterprise devices. This is quite easy. As said, there will be a separate video about this going into detail, and it's also explained in detail in the manual, but we will go through this very quickly because it's quite easy. You have to do this once, and after you did it once, it will be quite easy for you to do. First time may seem a bit weird, or you may be not doing something exactly correctly. The basic idea is you have to reset the device. So if you use Android Enterprise for the enhanced work profile, so a company device with a container or a fully managed device, in both cases you need to reset the device. And after it's reset, you will be greeted by a welcome message. This may be look different depending on your device model and operating system version. So don't worry, sometimes it says welcome, sometimes it says hello, sometimes it says let's go. That's different from device to device, but you will have some kind of text that greets you. And on this text, the first thing you see, you can tap 6 times, as written here. And tapping 6 times on this welcome message will tell the operating system that it should enroll with Android Enterprise. And depending on the operating system, you will first be asked to enter Wi-Fi, so it downloads a QR code reader. On most systems, I think like Android 9 and higher, it will already come with a QR code reader, so it will instantly start the QR code reader and ask for Wi-Fi afterwards. And this QR code can be get in 2 ways. There are 2 ways to get this. Basically, it's just 2 different workflows and you use whatever you want. One way is to generate a QR code right here. This is a general purpose QR code which can be used multiple times and will automatically create a device in the console, and you can move it wherever you want. We will see this a bit later. The other way around would be to first create a device which will give you a QR code specific for this device. And like I said, you tap on the device, it starts a QR code reader. You can scan this QR code, which contains every information the device needs, so it knows what it should download and where it should enroll. So you simply scan the QR code, enter the Wi-Fi, accept some terms and conditions like you usually do on Android, and after a short wait time you will instantly be on the home screen. Our app will already be installed and already be connected to the MDM server, and depending on where the device is, in which group and what you configured, it will already configure, for example, mail account, download apps, and everything else. So basically, to sum it up, the setup process for Android Enterprise is basically reset the device, tap on the screen, scan QR code, enter Wi-Fi or enter SIM card, and that's it. Pretty easy. Like I said, it's really easy to do. Sometimes you just have to find out where exactly you have to tap. That can be different depending on the device model, but that's it. Pretty easy. Then I would shortly want to mention Knox Enrollment and Zero Touch. Both are basically the same, and both are basically what I already said about DEP. General idea is you buy the device from a vendor that supports it. Again, that's important. Not every vendor supports Knox Enrollment or Zero Touch. And then you will have a special account in the Knox Enrollment or Zero Touch portal, which you then configure and can connect to our system, which allows you to get, if you get the device, to get it out of the box, turn it on, connect it to the internet, and it will automatically enroll itself, so you don't have to scan or enter anything. Knox Enrollment is from Samsung for Samsung devices. Zero Touch is basically from Google for basically every kind of device. But yeah, that's about them. Then I want to talk about the content box. The content box is a cloud data storage, like for example Nextcloud, Dropbox, Google Drive, or whatever. You know, all these kind of things. They all work kind of the same. The general idea is that it's allowing you to get content or data on the device or files. We will see this later in a bit more detail. The content box is always included in a small, free to test kind of package, meaning it's limited to 25 devices and 100 megabyte in the cloud. If you should test it and see, okay, that's something I need, that's something I want to use in a bigger scope, then you can buy licenses for the content box, allowing you to get licenses and use it for more than 25 devices. And in terms of the cloud, allowing you to use 25 gigabyte of space. If you host the server yourself, the space limit is lifted and you just have as much space as your server offers. In the LDAP configuration, we have an LDAP import. The general idea, just to make it quite simple, I use a bit higher numbers. If you, for example, have 1,000 users, 1,000 coworkers, which should get implemented in the MDM because you want to assign devices to them, you don't really want to create 1,000 users manually, especially not if you already have them in an Active Directory. In this case, you can simply enter all the things you need so that the system is able to connect to your Active Directory, and you can also work with filters to simply import all the users you have in the Active Directory so they get created in the MDM and you can work with them inside the MDM. This can also be automated, so new users get automatically implemented and depending on your configuration maybe also deleted. So this allows you to easily get your users into the MDM. If you don't have an Active Directory but maybe another system similar, you can also import users with a CSV file. Otherwise you can also create them manually. Then I want to say a few words about the Universal Gateway. The Universal Gateway is a special add-on you can buy, which is always a separate virtual machine and has two different functions as of now. One of the different functions is the email gateway configuration, which allows you to secure your own Exchange server. So for example, the idea is that if you're hosting your own Exchange server, in your own network, but you have mobile devices that are outside of your own network, you still want that these devices are able to send and receive mails. So one of the simple solutions most people tend to use is, okay, then I have to make my Exchange server reachable from the outside, which of course you can do, and it's a simple solution, but of course comes with some security problems. First of all, if it's reachable from the whole internet, everyone who somehow gets their hands on login data, on valid login data, is able to log in and do whatever they want. And the other thing is, if there is a security vulnerability that has not been fixed yet and can be exploited from the outside, this could happen, and the Universal Gateway basically fights both of these problems. The general idea is that you take back your Exchange server from the public internet, and instead you place the Universal Gateway, which works as a reverse proxy, but not only a simple reverse proxy. The Universal Gateway also checks if the device trying to connect doesn't only have valid login credentials, but also is a device which is enrolled in the MDM and should have a mail account. So, for example, if someone steals valid login credentials and tries to connect with valid login credentials, the Universal Gateway will decline this connection and deny it because it's not a device which is inside the MDM. So this solves this problem. The other thing is that the Universal Gateway is not an Exchange server, so yeah, normal security vulnerabilities that can be exploited from the outside will not work on the Universal Gateway, making your mail server way more secure. What you can also do optionally, which is a nice to have thing, is configure the whole connection with Kerberos, which is a single sign-on method which allows you to simply log in the email accounts of your users so they never have to enter a password again. So if they don't know the password, it will automatically authenticate, and if the password should change in the background for some reason, they don't have to re-enter the password, so they never have to enter the password for the mail account. The other thing is the option to configure it as a VPN server. The basic concept of VPN should be clear. So, for example, if you maybe don't have an internal Exchange server, but maybe something else, some kind of ticket system, file system, or whatever you want to make available for your devices outside, you will need a VPN connection. You can also configure other VPN connections with the MDM, but doing it with the Universal Gateway may be the easiest way to do so, because in the whole process of setting up things and configuring things, the Universal Gateway aims to be as easy as possible, while other VPN solutions may tend to be a bit more complicated. The general setup of the Universal Gateway is quite simple, and configuring the VPN connections for the devices is way more simple. For example, with other VPN solutions, depending on which operating system you use, you maybe have to check, is my system able to do this natively in my operating system, or do I have to configure certain apps, or how do I configure them, what parameters I need, what address I have to enter, and all these kind of things you maybe have to think about, and maybe different on different operating systems. In case of the Universal Gateway, because the MDM is developed by us and the Universal Gateway is developed by us, they both communicate and do all this kind of thing completely automated. So you simply have to tell the system that your group of devices should get a VPN connection, and everything else gets configured automatically, and you don't have to think about any more details, and it will just work. So this makes your VPN configuration extremely easy. You can also enhance your VPN configuration via the gateway with black or white list based on domain names. So the network or the whole traffic which goes through the Universal Gateway is limited in a certain way. In the app management, we have the in-house app database where you can upload your own apps that you have developed yourself, for example, or for other reasons have as a file on your computer. This is something you mainly only do if you really want to distribute an app which is not available in public stores. Like I said, if you, for example, developed it yourself or got it developed by another company or something like that, then you are able to upload your different apps here. You can also get an overview over which versions you have uploaded, how big they are, and can also set them as an update target, so the system knows which is the currently up-to-date app you want to distribute. This is something that sometimes happens on Android, rarely happens on iOS, and regularly happens on Windows. And depending on what exactly you want to upload here, you can do this here for all kind of operating systems. Then I want to quickly talk about VPP. VPP is quite easy. We have a separate video for that on our YouTube channel, which explains every detail on setting this up initially. So I'm not going to show this here. It's quite easy. You simply have to know it exists and where to go in the business manager. Besides that, that it would not be very interesting to show this here. But what I want to talk about VPP is what is VPP and why you should use it, because most likely if you look up what VPP is, you will miss a very important point in my opinion. and a very important point you should be aware of. Because VPP means Volume Purchase Program, the initial idea was from Apple to offer a system which allows you to easily buy and distribute paid apps. Before VPP or without VPP, you would need, if you, for example, distribute a paid app to 10 devices, you would need to log in on every 10 devices and pay on every device again, log in on every device again, which is with 10 devices maybe okay, but depending on the number of devices you have, that's not really something you would do. And VPP basically offers a solution to that, which allows you to basically buy how many licenses you need in one go and simply distribute them to the devices, and you don't need any Apple ID, any login or something else. The app will just be installed and works. But as you can see in my list, I only have free apps here, because you can do the same thing with free apps as you can do with paid apps, and you still have benefits. Because if you distribute free apps without VPP, you can do that. That's possible. That's an option. You need an Apple ID on the device, and this Apple ID, so you need an Apple ID on the device, which is not sometimes the case. You need to log into the Apple ID, so you have to enter the password. You have to confirm the installation, and depending on the configuration of the Apple ID or for which country it's registered, maybe the installation fails. So you have a lot of problems and a lot of manual interaction you don't want to have if you use an MDM. With VPP, all these things are gone. If you use VPP to distribute free apps, you don't need an Apple ID on the device. The user doesn't have to confirm anything or enter any password or anything else. The app will just be installed and ready to go. So our recommendation is, once you want to install at least one app on Apple devices, you maybe want to look into VPP and configure this. Like I said, for configuring, check out our video on our YouTube channel. It's not that hard. You simply have to log into the business manager and go to a certain place and download the token. Uploaded it here, and afterwards it's connected and can be used. And after the first connection, after setting up the token here, you simply have to go to the business manager in the app section, search your app and get how many licenses you need in the business manager. And after a few moments or maybe a few minutes, it may be ready in the MDM, and you can assign these apps as as mandatory apps. We will see this later. But that's the general idea of VPP and why you should use it. In the AE Play Store section, we have some things depending and with Android Enterprise and apps. So first of all, I have all my approved apps here, so not that interesting in the first place or at the beginning. Afterwards, I have the Play Store setting here, which already is kind of self-explanatory, I think, where you can just search for apps in the Play Store. Basic stuff, you search your app or click on it, and if you want to use this app, you can allow it here, and after you allowed it, it will shown here. After you approved it, it will show here and will also be shown when configuring mandatory apps. So basic workflow for Android Enterprise and app management is basically look up your app here, approve it, and afterwards go to your devices or your group profile and assign it as a mandatory app. We will see this later too. So pretty basic workflow, no need for anything other. You just need the normal Android Enterprise setup we talked about. Otherwise, you don't need anything like a token or something like that. You can also upload your own private apps. This is, for example, if you develop your own app and you don't want to normally publish it in the Play Store, so it's public available. You can also upload it as a private app, so it's not available to anyone. It's only available to you. It will be available very fast, and you have some benefits from the Play Store, like better update management and the better feedback, for example, for crashes and stuff like that. So if you're interested in this, you can upload your private apps here. This can also be interesting if you, for example, have an app which you also distribute to 2 or 3 other companies. You can use that as well to only give them access to your private app. You can also define web apps, which is basically just a shortcut on the home screen to a website, which looks like an app until you click on it and it opens a website. That's basically a web app. You can create them here, and after creating one, you can just distribute them like normal apps. And then we have the store layout. I'm not going into detail for this one because this is kind of specific, so we will leave that for now. And otherwise, we have the most important things. We have talked about the most important things in the general management or general settings. And now we will go to the mobile management. This is where you, maybe spend most of your time in the long run, because you will have your groups and your users and your devices in this section here. How you exactly structure this and how your structure may look entirely depends upon you. This is completely different for everyone. Just look that you have a setup that where you can find everything and where you understand your own logic. So it's totally up to you if you maybe throw everything into one group or you split it in different groups and different parts like here. That's entirely up to you. In this section, you can, for example, like we talked about before, there are different ways to enroll devices, for example, automatically, like we talked about in for Android with Knox Enrollment Zero Touch, or even the general QR code for Android Enterprise, or for example, in case of Apple with the Apple configurator or with DEP. If you use some kind of these things where devices get created automatically in the enrollment process, you will find them in the device pools here. So for example, Android devices coming from the general QR code will land here, Apple devices will land here, and so on. So these can be found in these pools and afterwards moved via drag and drop to wherever you want them. If you don't use anything like that, so for example, your Apple devices are not the EP devices, or like I said earlier, in case of Android, you want to first create a device, you can do so by right-clicking a group and add a device, or do the same on user level. You can add devices to a user or a group, that's entirely up to you, and say add and enroll the device. This section is pretty straightforward. You give the device a name, define a phone number if you want to, define an alternative email address. I will say something about this in a second. Select your operating system, so for example, Android Enterprise and Android Enterprise Fully Managed. And you have 3 buttons here that send out an enrollment request. In this enrollment request, it is written what you have to do, what steps to follow, and maybe which QR code you have to scan. The exact content, of course, is completely dependent on what you choose here above. And the first switch basically sends this enrollment request to the email address of the user itself, so he can do these things himself. Or you say, for example, okay, I'm the administrator, I have the device in my hands now and I want to enroll it. So you can check this switch here and it will send email to the alternative email address, which is this one. Or you can say, I want to send it as an enrollment SMS, so the whole information gets sent as an SMS to the phone number you have configured here. The SMS thing, of course, you have to think about if you need it or not. It depends, it really depends on the case. There are certain use cases and enrollment cases where this is quite interesting, because depending on the use case, for example, with bring your own device containers, you will get a link and you simply have to click on a link and to enroll the device, and you don't have to scan anything or type anything. You just have a link in an SMS on your device, you tap on it and it enrolls. This of course doesn't work for all enrollment methods that easily. Like I said before, for example, for Android Enterprise Fully Managed device, you have to reset the device, so the SMS is no use for you. But you can also enable all the things you want, and like I said, for many things, SMS enrollment can be nice. Otherwise, you just have to choose if you want to send it to the user itself or to an alternative email address like yourself. And yeah, that way you can create a device. After creating a device, it will be gray and will turn green after it's enrolled. And after it turned green and is enrolled, I see a lot of information about the device. If I click on it, I see, battery, free storage, IP address, and many other different things. And I could go here on the left side through all the different sections to configure something, enable restrictions, define apps that should be installed, and all this kind of things. But what you should do instead, doing this for this specific device, go on group level. For example, first level is a group in my case here, and you will be able to define group profiles for this group, which of course makes it way easier for you because you have one group profile, you have one place where you configure everything, which will then be applied to basically infinite number of devices. So if you click on group, you usually get greeted with this section where it's split up in all the different manufacturers and different device types. So as you can see, for example, for the iPhones that are corporate devices, I have defined the developer profile. Same goes for iPad. Here, for the Android Enterprise Work Manager devices, I have configured a profile named support, and I can change it if I want to here as well. And for example, in the developer profile, I have already configured some settings. I have already enabled some restrictions. I have already set some mandatory apps, and all this gets applied to every iPhone that's within this group. So it makes it very easy for me. And if I need to make any change, I can click here and change and click on edit profile. And every change I make to the group profile after assigning it, it will be assigned to every iPhone in this group. So it makes it very easy for me to configure multiple devices in one go. This is why we recommend to always use group profiles for configurations, because otherwise it might get confusing. And in the end of the day, all devices will be configured the same, which is what you most likely want if you use an MDM. Nevertheless, even though I said you should configure everything on device on group level, I will stay on device level. This is for a certain reason, because if you click on device level, for example, you see device related information, and you only see this if you select a device, and there are certain views which are only visible on device level. We are only speaking, in this case, we are only speaking about views which give you information, not views where you configure anything. So in terms of information and what you can see, I will stay on device level, because I want to show these different options you have, and or what you can see, and everything else we will talk about, which is related to configuring things or restricting things or setting up apps or everything where you configure something in any way, is the same on device level and group level. So everything we will talk about in a moment, you can do the exact same thing on group level for 100 or 1,000 or millions of devices. Yeah, but I will start here with an Android Enterprise fully managed device, and will later go to an iOS device and afterwards to a Windows device. I start with Android, and we'll go into every detail here, and we'll speed things up a little bit on the later operating systems for a certain reason, because some things are basically completely identical on all operating systems besides minor details. So for example, if you know where or how to set up a mail account on one operating system, you know where to find it and how to do it on every other operating system. So we will use this as a base, and basically on the other operating systems only mention the big difference, which are really completely different. Exactly. Like I said, we have if you select a device, we have a general overview with some information about the device. And we have other tabs at the top here, which are mainly for troubleshooting, so we don't go into detail here. But we also have the device settings, which controls the behavior of our app. For example, on other operating systems, the main part of the management is not an app, but it's implemented in the operating system. In case of Android, the main core of the management is our app, and therefore our app has certain behaviors, and of course therefore a certain way how you can configure them. I only want to go through the most important things here. For most customers, it's fine to just enable the top button here, and the app will just use the default configuration. And that's totally fine for most customers, but if you want to change anything here, you can enable this and change whatever you want. For example, we have the data collection frequency. It's just how often the system collects data from the device, like for example, battery, free storage, installed apps, and all these kind of information from the device. So if you want that the information about your devices are as up to date as possible, you set this to a very low value, or if you do not care at all, you set it to a high value or even disable it. The device heartbeat frequency should not be important for many people, but in some cases this can be useful in certain network setups. So the idea is, or generally, if you are trying to make changes, this will be sent from our server to the push service of the manufacturer, for example Google, and Google will send it to the device, and afterwards the device contacts us to get the new configuration. But in some cases this push may not work correctly, or maybe be very delayed. Like I said, maybe you are in a network where this is maybe even blocked by the firewall and you cannot change the firewall because it's not your own network. You can define a device heartbeat, which basically skips most of the steps I just talked about, and the device will just connect to the server on its own to look for new configuration. So for example, if I set the device heartbeat to 2 hours and I make any change and for some reason the push does not work, I am sure, okay, at least in 2 hours or earlier, the device will contact the server itself and get the new configuration I provided. So if you have such a troublesome network and you want that your changes are applied as soon as possible, you maybe want to set a lower value. Or if you know, okay, no, the push connection works fine in my network, you set a medium or high value, because in this case you highly likely don't need it. Yeah. The other thing is, if you want to record GPS data, if you enable it, GPS data will be recorded and you can define how often this is done. Of course, keep in mind, depending on your device, this may impact battery performance, and depending on your data plan, this may require some amount of data. So if you have a very limited data plan or a very weak device with a weak battery, you don't want to set this to 1 minute. Otherwise, it's totally up to you on how often you want to set this. Otherwise, a few things on how to how this GPS data is recorded. You can enable both methods here for more precision, but in some cases, on some devices, maybe Google location accuracy is not working or not available. In this case, you maybe want to disable this, but otherwise you highly likely want to enable all of them for better precision. And otherwise, the other configurations are a bit more special, so I don't want to go into detail here. You can also define a wallpaper for the devices. So for example, all devices get a specific wallpaper. You can define a color or upload an image. That's pretty self-explanatory. In the asset management, you see really every detail about the device that we can get. So if you, for example, need the model number again, or the IP address, or whatever data you want, you maybe want to look in here. In security management and anti-theft, we have the recorded GPS data, or in my case, I have a password prompt. Like I said earlier, you have the option to protect your GPS data you recorded with 1 or 2 passwords. In my case, I made it only 1 password because it's easier to use. But in your case, if you have 2 passwords, you maybe have 2 password fields here. And only after unlocking the GPS data, I will get this view here, which is basically pretty self-explanatory. In my case, it's a dummy device. I currently don't have GPS data, but it's easy to understand. You have a map up here, and you will have the recorded GPS data down here with the timestamp, and you can just click on it and the map will jump to where it was. Pretty easy to use, pretty easy to understand. In wipe and lock, we have some options to wipe or lock the device. We have the same things also if we right click a device. So there are different ways to do it. The first thing you have is the full wipe. That's pretty basic. That's something you already maybe know. It's the classic full wipe, the classic factory reset. Device gets deleted, every data gets deleted, and you will start on the welcome screen and it looks just like a device which comes fresh out of the box. This can be interesting if the device gets stolen or lost, and yeah, the data on the device is more important than the device itself. In this case, you maybe want to send a full wipe. Enterprise wipe is mostly interesting if you are running a container setup in any way, because this will remove the MDM and the container and everything business related. This is interesting if the device is used privately by the user and maybe he leaves the company and is allowed to take the device with him, or buys the device from the company for a small amount of money, and in such cases you can just send an enterprise wipe, everything MDM and work related will be removed, every private data and app will stay on the device, and he can just leave the company. Lock screen does exactly that. It locks the screen normally, just like like it does in idle, or for example, if you manually lock the device, and can be unlocked by the user. Too, this can be interesting if you're maybe not sure if the device is lost or stolen, or maybe it's just lying in the car below the seat. So you lock the device in first place, just so it's locked and it's not in someone's hands in an unlocked state. And afterwards, maybe you find the device and the user can simply unlock it again, or you don't find the device very quickly and you can still send the full wipe. Talking about lock screen, in the security configuration, we have the option to define a password restriction, or a password rule for the device. So the device has to have a device passcode, but it doesn't should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or something like this. Then you can define different rules here, how complex it should be, how long it should be, how old it's allowed to get before the user has to define a new passcode, and everything you know about password restrictions normally in other systems you can do here as well for the device. And if the device comes back to you and the user forgot the passcode, or you get the device and you don't know the passcode, you can clear it here as well, so you don't have to reset the device fully only because you forgot the passcode. In Antivirus, you are able to configure the antivirus solution Icarus, which you can also get licenses from us. Icarus is a paid add-on which you can get if you want to easily distribute and configure an antivirus app on your Android devices. Pretty straightforward here. You enable it. If you enable it, Icarus will be installed, and you can define all the configuration, how often it should be scanned, how detailed it should be scanned, how often it should update, and all this kind of things. So the app will be installed and configured and scan for threats. How often you set it here, so your devices are protected. In the restrictions, we have many different restrictions. As you can see, there are a lot of them. Due to the sheer amount, I will not go into detail here, also because some or most of the configuration are very easy to understand, and there's nothing to explain. For example, enable automatic time, automatic time zone. Most things are pretty easy to understand. Otherwise are explained in the question mark. There are just all the things you can think about in terms of restricting a device or disallowing functionality you will find here. At the bottom as well, you can control the operating system updates. So for example, they get installed automatically or only automatically within a certain time frame. So for example, only evening, or you can even postpone them so they get delayed by 30 days. And otherwise, a lot of restrictions. I'm not going into detail here, otherwise that will take very long, and most of these things explain themselves just by the name. In the certificate management, I'm able to distribute certain certificates, for example, trusted certificates. So my device trusts a certain website. This can be interesting if you have some kind of web server which is just signed, or which just has a self-signed SSL certificate. So you can do the self-signed, distribute the self-signed root CA to the devices so they trust this website, or you can distribute identity certificates so the devices can log into a Wi-Fi VPN or whatever way you can need an identity certificate. In the connection management, we have the option to configure one or multiple Wi-Fis. This is also pretty easy to use. You set the SSID, choose your security type, enter the password, and the Wi-Fi gets configured on the device, and the user can connect to that Wi-Fi without entering the password, and therefore doesn't even need to know the password, cannot tell anyone the password on purpose or by accident, or is not able to enter a private device into the Wi-Fi, which makes the Wi-Fi also a bit more secure. You can also do this for multiple Wi-Fi. So if you have multiple locations the user is switching between and they have different Wi-Fis, you can configure all of them so they never have to ever configure a device themselves, a Wi-Fi. In the VPN, we basically have the same thing. You can configure a VPN configuration from different VPN methods and just enter your configuration here. The VPN connection will be created on the device and can be used by the user. This can also be done as a per app VPN. So for example, if I define Firefox, if Firefox starts, the VPN configuration starts as well. And depending on the VPN solution, for example, with our gateway VPN, this can also be configured as an always-on VPN. So for example, the whole traffic always goes through the VPN, which then allows you to filter the traffic and, for example, block certain websites. Otherwise, you can configure one or multiple VPNs, which will be configured on the device. This is also pretty easy to understand usually. In VPN Management, we have the option to configure an Exchange account, which will be configured on the device, which allows the user to access mails, send mails, and even calendar and contacts. This is also pretty easy. You just enter the usual things you normally have to provide when configuring an Exchange account: hostname, email address, etc. That's why I don't go into detail here. Most things are completely clear for people who ever configured an Exchange account in their life. So this should be easy to use. Another thing I want to explain here is something I can explain very well with Exchange accounts as an example. That's the placeholders. Because of course, if you have a group with 100 users, you want that every one of these 100 users gets their own mail account on the device. To do this, of course, if you enter a mail address in the group profile, you don't want that every 100 of them gets the same email address. And you also don't want to click on every device of every of this user to define this manually. And this is where placeholders come into play. So for example, as an email address, I can enter %usermail%, which basically tells the system to look for the email address of the user before sending it out. So if I enter this as the email address, before it gets sent out to the devices, the system will look, okay, what's the email address of this user, replaces this with the email address of the user and sends it out to the device, which allows you to configure 100 or 1,000 or million different mail accounts in one group profile. This, of course, requires you to set up your users correctly and provide correct information when creating them, because somewhere the data has to come from. For example, if we had to, or if we did the LDAP import, where the users get automatically imported from the Active Directory, this is high likely already correct and makes it easy for you. But otherwise, if you create your users manually or through a CSV file, you of course should make sure that your users have the correct mail address, because otherwise, of course, this logic doesn't make sense. But that's the best way, or one of the best ways, where you high likely always want to use placeholders when configuring Exchange accounts. But these placeholders can not only be used for Exchange accounts, these can be used basically everywhere where you have text fields in the MDM. So this can be used for VPN configurations, for Wi-Fi configurations, for app configurations. There is really no limit. So if you want to use it somewhere else, or for example, for a lock screen message which shows on the lock screen, you can use placeholders there as well. There is really no limit, but like I said, at least for Exchange accounts, you high likely will use it, at least in this section. In the app management, we have the Enterprise App Manager, where we can see the installed apps of a device, the system apps, and the mandatory apps. The mandatory apps is how you maybe think about it. These apps which will be automatically installed. To do so, I simply click on the plus button here, and I will have my uploaded in-house apps, which I uploaded myself. Like I said earlier, not many people do this, but if you have such an app, you can select it here. Otherwise, you have the Play Store apps, which you approved in the Play Store. We talked about this a few minutes ago, where we were in the Play Store and just looked up our apps and approved it. And after approving, there will be showing up here. So I can just click on an app and add it, and it will be added to the mandatory app list. And if I save and assign it, if I do this on the bottom right here, this will be sent out to the devices and will be installed automatically without a Google account, without interaction from the user. Device just gets downloaded, the app just gets downloaded and installed and done. What you can also do is click on an app you added to the mandatory app list, and we will request certain information from the Google server if you click on an app. For example, like who is it from, build information and all this kind of stuff, but also the information if an app is able to be configured. If an app supports manage configuration, the configuration tab will appear. Keep in mind, not every app supports manage configuration. That's different from app to app. And if an app supports it, you can see the configuration options here, enable it, and configure your app in detail. How many options you have, what options you have, how they are named, or how they are described in the question mark text, that's entirely up to the developer of the app. So in this case, we have an app that's pretty detailed, a lot of information and a lot of options here. There may be other apps which only have 1 or 2 options. That's totally up to the developer. So maybe if you see there are options, but you're missing something, you can maybe contact the developer and ask him to edit. Otherwise, it's pretty self-explanatory. If an app can be configured and you want to do it, you just go through all these options here, configure it however you want, and afterwards save it. And this configuration will be applied to the app and the devices which have them installed. So for example, like I said earlier, I could also use the different placeholders here. So it makes sense to click at least once on every of your app and just look if there is an option to configure them and what you can do. High likely there is at least one app that supports it and offers you interesting options. In the black and white listing, we have options to black or whitelist apps. This should also be very easy to understand. Apps on the blacklist are blocked and cannot be accessed and are not shown. And apps on the whitelist are allowed and everything else is blocked. Pretty normal black and white listing system in terms of apps. Then we have a very special tab here, the Android Enterprise System apps. As you may have seen earlier, when generating the QR code, you have an option to keep or not keep system apps. And we generally recommend to not keep system apps when setting up Android Enterprise devices. And if you miss any system app, you can enable them afterwards, because in most cases, that's something that's up to you. You have to look for that yourself. But in most cases, for example, you have 10 system apps and you only want one. So it's way easier to disable every of them in the setup process and just re-enable the one you need, instead of having 10 system apps enabled and blocking 9 of them. But that's something you have to check for yourself and balance for yourself. There may also be cases where you have, for example, 10 system apps and you want 7 of them. So it may be easier to keep system apps, the system apps in the setup process and block the 3 you do not want in the blacklist. But as said, from my experience, most people don't need that many of the pre-installed system apps, so you set up the device without the system apps and can re-enable missing system apps here. The process is very simple. You simply have to provide a package name, which should be re-enabled. This is something where you have to be a bit more careful to enter the correct thing. You cannot simply enter anything here, because it has to be precise and correct. So if you miss any system app, you can just select any of your devices, go to system apps, because even though they are not enabled, they will still be listed here. So for example, if I say I want Android Auto to be re-enabled, I can look for Android Auto. I see that's here. I can copy the package name and just enter it here, and the app will be re-enabled on my devices. So pretty straightforward. So if you miss any app, in most cases and most devices, it may be the camera, for example, you just look up what is the system app name or the package name and add it here, and the system app will be re-enabled and can just be used normally. No, these things are not that interesting. In the kiosk mode, we have the single and URL kiosk mode. Both do basically almost the same thing. One with an URL, the other one with an app. So for example, when setting up the single app kiosk mode, the app you define here will be in the foreground. It will be open and the user cannot leave this app. No matter what he does, no matter what he presses, he cannot leave this app you have defined. So this can be interesting in certain use cases where you really only need one app. So for example, if it's in some kind of presentation or some kind of where you have it built in some kind of store system or wherever you really only need one app. This can be interesting and will be interesting, but as soon as you want 2 or more apps on the device to use, the single app or URL kiosk mode are high likely not that interesting. In this case, in terms of Android specifically, there is the multi-app kiosk mode, which does not limit you to one app, but maybe 2 or 3 or however, how many you define here. This is a very special mode, which is very restrictive and very clean and really disables a lot of things and hides a lot of things. So if you want your device very clean and a lot of things hidden, you maybe want to try out the multi-app kiosk mode. A short note about the multi-app kiosk mode. The multi-app kiosk mode is nothing we can normally just do on Android. It requires the AppTec launcher, and the AppTec launcher is a paid add-on. So if you should test the multi-app kiosk mode and see, okay, yeah, that's something I want, that's something I need, in this case, you also need licenses for the AppTec launcher. But that's about the kiosk mode. Another thing here in remote control, I currently do not have to set up, but it's pretty straightforward. You have different options to start remote control on the devices. In terms of Android, it's not only TeamViewer, it's also Splashtop. Both do basically the same thing, and the logic is quite simple. You need to configure your Splashtop or TeamViewer account in the general settings and set the corresponding app as a mandatory app. So for example, in terms of TeamViewer, it's TeamViewer Quick Support. And once you have your account connected, your account has a valid license or subscription. Your TeamViewer account, for example, has a valid subscription to access mobile devices, and the app is installed and it's connected to our MDM. You can just right-click a device and start a TeamViewer remote control session. Keep in mind that this requires a special TeamViewer and or Splashtop subscription, and we only do the technical integration here. So we currently do not sell any TeamViewer or Splashtop licenses or subscriptions. For any questions about prices and all this kind of account and subscription related things, please contact TeamViewer or Splashtop. And once your account is able to connect to Splashtop or to mobile devices via Splashtop or TeamViewer, you can configure this here as well. And like I said, just distribute the corresponding app, and afterwards you can right click your devices to start a remote session. In the content management, we have the content box. We will talk about it in a second. And we have the secure browser, which is a special browser developed by us, which gives you a lot of configuration options. So if you, for example, on your devices need access to some kind of website, web page, or something like that, but don't want to let the users do everything in the internet, you can use the secure browser to limit the use of the device or the browser. You can, for example, set a password for the browser specifically if it's connected to a VPN, for example, so not everyone who can access the device and the browser can also access some kind of internal data, so this can be an extra security layer. You can also restrict downloads and uploads. You can restrict the clipboard, the screen capture, so no screen recording or screenshot can be done from some kind of site opened in the secure browser. You can also clean up the data on the browser automatically. So for example, this is in some kind of a warehouse where every day another person takes the device, so the data is, for example, cleared every day, and the one who's taking the device tomorrow doesn't see the history and open tabs from the person who had it today. You can also define bookmarks, so you can easily tap on a bookmark to open a link. That's especially interesting if you have multiple URLs you want to open and they are maybe a bit more complex. You can just add them here as a bookmark. You can also hide the address bar if it contains sensitive information, and you can of course also use a whitelisting, so only specific URLs or domains can be accessed with the browser and everything else gets blocked. So if this browser should only give your users access to, for example, an internal ticket system, you can limit it to that and they cannot access anything else on the internet with that. The content box can be enabled here. If I enable the content box app will be installed on the device, and the device will have access to the contents in the contents in the content box. That's how you say it. And to do so, or to talk about that, we will jump into the group. And if we go into the group, we have here on the left content management, and this will give us this here. where I have on the right the option to upload another file. I already have uploaded a file, which is, for example, a manual. So every device, or if the devices have the content box installed, they can access this manual. And if I should change it, upload a new version of it, the next time they try to access it, they will get the new version. So if I have anything like pictures of a certain product, or a price list, or I don't know, some kind of demonstration video, I can always change out the file with a new version, and the devices will get them automatically, and I don't have to send them around via mail and hope everyone has seen the mail and downloaded the new file or something like that, which is pretty neat. So that's basically the general overview over Android at this point, and most of the system in the MDM, or at least the most important things about the MDM. As said before, I will now go into an iOS device and go through some things here. As you already see here on the left, a lot of the structure and the general categories are the same. That's what I already said. Most things are structured the same and can be found in the same place, and the only difference lies in the detail that maybe iOS has an option which Android doesn't have, or the other way around. But we don't go into detail here and now list every minor detail that makes a difference. I will now only or mainly focus on the big things that are extremely different from, for example, Android or Windows. As said before, we have the device overview, general information about the device. We have a few device settings. In this case, also like we saw on Android, setting up an background image. We have the automatic OS updates. Everything we just had on Android, just now called a bit different, located a bit different, but same thing. All this is something we also have on Android. Nothing special. Lock screen messages. We can set automatic time zone, something we already talked about. The asset management, basically the same thing here, just a lot of information about the device, where we can, for example, check again the model number. Security management, anti-theft, the same thing. I can see the GPS data here. In my case, it's protected with 1Password. Same thing here. We have a lot of options to wipe the device with full wipe, enterprise wipe, and even perform a lock for the lock screen. Same as on other operating systems as well. We talked about that. Again, here, security configurations, we can set password restrictions or password requirements. Same thing, minimal difference in available options and how they are structured, but basically same thing here. I can define a passcode restriction, so the device has a passcode which follows these rules, and an option to reset the passcode if I don't know it or the user lost it. In the restriction settings here as well, a lot of information and a huge amount of restrictions, which is why I don't go into detail here. Again, most of these restrictions are self-explanatory. Allow camera, allow Siri. That's usually not something you have to explain in detail. What I would do instead here is something you maybe already seen currently in one of the other views for iOS, is this text here. In some places or at some switches or some categories, you will see this text which says available in supervised mode. And about this supervised mode, I currently want to talk about. And the supervised mode is a special mode the iOS operating system can be in and can be set up. And if the device is running in this so-called supervised mode, we have the option to do many more things and access many more restrictions, which is why you have this text here to indicate this requires a special setup of the device. So first of all, you just have to think about if you even need such options. So for example, you just should go in here and just look, okay, what are my options that require the supervised mode, because that's very subjective if you need it or not. And maybe you say, okay, I don't need this option, so you don't need the supervised mode. The general rule of thumb I always give, or the general advice I always give, is if you want to give the user freedom, so for example, he can use the device privately, you maybe don't need the supervised mode, because most of the settings in the supervised mode are very restrictive. And if you're using a container scenario or where the user can use the device privately, you highly likely don't really need the supervised mode. On the other hand, of course, if you want a fully managed device, which is mainly for work and should be under your full control, you high likely need the supervised mode because, as I said, most things that require the supervised mode are very restrictive. And if you want to be very, very restrictive, you high likely need the supervised mode. So in this case, let's say you need the supervised mode. The question would be, how do I bring the devices into the supervised mode? And we basically talked about the answer for that, for both answers for that before. One is DEP. We talked about DEP, the device enrollment program. So if you buy the devices from a vendor which supports it and the devices get automatically enrolled via DEP, you can, in the configuration of DEP, you can just set a switch which which basically brings every device coming through DEP into the supervised mode. So if you're using DEP, this is not a big deal for you. You just enable this in your DEP profile and that's it. And your devices are all in the supervised mode. So let's say you don't have DEP or you cannot use DEP or for some reason. In this case, you have the option to do that with the Apple configurator. This is something I mentioned before. The Apple configurator, to remind you, is a software you can get on macOS and currently only in macOS. It's a free software you can just download and plug in your devices via USB. After doing so, the devices can be accessed or can be selected on the macOS system in the configurator, and you can just tell the device to set the device up and set it into the supervised mode. And in the same step, as I said before, you can also enroll them into the MDM. So if you need the supervised mode, but you're not using DEP, you high likely or really need the Apple configurator on macOS. Plug in your devices via USB and use the configurator not only to set them into the supervised mode, but maybe also enroll them into the MDM in the same step. And that's currently the two only ways to bring devices in the supervised mode. As said before, you maybe just have to think about what you want to do with your devices, and depending on that, you maybe need or don't need the supervised mode. We have the certificate management here, same as on the other operating systems. I see the installed certificates. I can define trusted certificates and identity certificates, can upload them here and distribute to the to the device. On iOS here as well, I can define a container. I talked about it a little bit for Android before, that you have a container option where everything goes into the work container and is separate from the private device. I talked about this at the beginning of my explanation about Android Enterprise. Of course, the same thing can be done with iOS. I will not go into too much detail because this could be especially complicated if you just start using an MDM, but there are basically two ways to do that. Same as Android, for example, you have a device completely enrolled into the MDM with full control over the device, like we have here in this case, and enable a container afterwards, which you can just do by one of the options here. There's also a special setup method to set up an iOS device in a basically only container mode, which is usually recommended for private devices, which are added to the MDM, because if you're doing it, for example, through configurator or DEP, like I did in my case here, you have full control over the device, which of course also gives you the option to wipe the device, which is usually something you do not want for a private device. Of course, you only have the option to wipe the device, but that's in most cases already problematic for some users, just knowing that you could wipe the device, maybe even by accident. So the special iOS bring your own device enrollment method, also known as user enrollment, basically would restrict the usage of the MDM only to the container itself. In my case, I'm on a fully managed device, which is in the supervised mode, just so I can show every option we have here. Like I said, if you have such a work device, for example, the company owns the device, but you want to have a container on it, you have two options here. The built-in container, which is built in iOS itself, doesn't cost anything, can be used by basically everyone. Only requirement is the iOS version shown up here, which should not be a big deal at the time of now. And you just enable the container here, and that's basically it. works in a very simple but very effective way. The general idea is everything that comes from the MDM is treated as work or as managed, and everything you do manually on the device is treated as basically private, also known as unmanaged, and those both sectors are just separated once you enable this option here. So once you enable this option here and, for example, configure an Exchange account through the MDM or install an app through the MDM, the data of this Exchange account and contacts or the data of the app you distribute will be treated as managed. And if you go onto the device itself and manually with your own hands install WhatsApp from the store or set up your own private mail account, this will be treated as unmanaged. On both basically islands, managed and unmanaged, will be separated, which is basically what you want in such a container scenario. So it's a pretty simple logic, but extremely effective. So if you want such a container solution, just enable this button, the switch here, and you can even customize it because some things are, for some users, maybe a bit too restrictive. For example, by default, screen capture is disabled, so users cannot make any kind of screenshot or screen recording. This is something where most customers say, okay, I allow that one, I just don't want that, for example, WhatsApp is accessing my work contacts. Then there's an alternative to the built-in container, which is the secure PIM container. Same thing, it has the goal to separate your private and work data. Secure PIM is a bit more focused on mail and calendar and contacts. Looks a bit different. The interaction with it is a bit different. It has a bit different options. There's no easy way to just simply say, now that's the big difference or that's the big difference. The difference is really found in many different details. So if you're interested in a container solution, you maybe want to check out both of them. Secure PIM is a paid solution. So yeah, like I said, you maybe want to check out both of them. Just contact our support if you want to have a test license for Secure PIM, and just decide on your own experience. Some people say, okay, Secure PIM has an option I really, really need. In this case, you go for Secure PIM. Or maybe you say, okay, both of them are fine for me, or I don't like the look of Secure PIM. That's something you have to figure out for yourself and just decide based on your own experience. Yeah. In the connection management, same as we had for Android, I can define a Wi-Fi and everything that's related to it, so it's automatically set up and can be used. And same for VPN, I select just my VPN solution, configure it, and it will be set up on the device and can be used. PIN management, also the exact same thing. You enter all the different things you need to set up an Exchange account. You can use the placeholders here. A small minor note, which is currently interesting as the time of recording this video, which is special for iOS devices, because Microsoft or Office 365 customers currently are forced to switch or automatically switched from a basic AUF to modern AUF, or called OAuth. And on Android, for example, most clients just understand this automatically and just automatically switch to modern AUF. On iOS, that's not the case. On iOS, you have to tell the mail app and the device to use modern AUF. So if you're using Office 365 and your login does not work, it says wrong password or authentication failure, you highly likely simply need to enable the button below here, which says OAuth. And for Office 365, for most customers, you leave these fields empty. You don't need them in most cases. If you need them, it's because you made some changes to the settings, and in this case, you already know where to get this data and what to fill in here. Otherwise, if you're just using Office 365, doesn't change any specific settings or something else, you just enable this and it will work. In Secure Messenger, we currently have the option to configure FreeMa Work. So if you're using FreeMa Work, you can define every kind of configuration here. That's also a lot, so I don't go into detail here. So everything you can think about configuring FreeMa Work, you will be able to find here. And you can also distribute license automatically if you have uploaded a license CSV file. Yeah. In the web management, we have the option to define a web clip. That's basically what I talked about, web apps on Android, which you could create in the general settings. For iOS, you can do this here. Same idea here as well. It's basically a website link you can find on the home screen and basically looks like an app. And once you tap on it, a certain website or URL you define here will be opened. And we also have a web content filter, which is a bit similar to the whitelist option we had in the secure browser on Android, where you can use Apple's own adult content filter, or you can also define specific websites which should only be accessed. So if you want the devices via Safari to be able to access certain URLs but not the entire internet, you can do that here. In the app management, same thing as for Android. We have the installed apps, managed apps, mandatory apps, which is the most important things for most people. Same logic here. We talked about app management with VPP already. So as said before, you should or you will highly likely want to use VPP and just get VPP licenses for whatever app you want. Afterwards, you can click on the plus here, select your in-house apps if you have uploaded anything yourself, or click on the VPP apps and just use your select your app you want, add it to the list, and it will be automatically installed on the device without any user confirmation or anything else. And you can quite similar to Android, you can also configure apps. Big difference is in this case, as you can see, it's a bit empty. As we said before on Android, we are able to get this information through an API from the Play Store. So we automatically can show you all the options an app has. On iOS, there is currently not such an API in the store. It's possible that it comes in the future, but as of now, it's not possible. So we cannot show you which app can be configured or what you can configure. This is something you have to investigate manually. Usually, if an app supports it, or another indicator is if an app supports it on Android, it's pretty likely it supports it on iOS as well. So you maybe want to check out the website of the app developer, and maybe there is an information about managed configuration, or if there is nothing like that, maybe you have to contact them by email and ask for information about managed configuration, and maybe they send you a PDF or a link to all the parameters you can set here, how they are called, and all this kind of things. So this is something where you need to bring a bit of manual effort into play. But normally this is something you only do once for an app, because once you know an app can be configured and how the configuration has to look like, you can work with that. So it still makes sense to just think about, okay, I have my certain apps and I really could see that setting in login credentials automatically or something like that could be interesting. So I just look on the website of the developer or contact them and look if we can get any information to configure these apps automatically. In restrictions and settings, same thing as here as on Android, black and white list for app management. Same logic here. For iOS, we also have the sysapp restrictions, which lists basically all available system apps. So if you have any app you want to disable, you can do that here. Or if you say, okay, I only want 2 system apps, you can disable every system app besides the 2 you want. So you can just enable and disable all the system apps however you like. A kiosk mode in a single app and URL way we have here as well. Same thing as we had before with Android, where you can limit a device to a certain app or URL. Then we have the option to define the screen layouts for iOS devices. This should also be easy to understand simply by just showing this. You place your apps in however order you want to have them, and they will be placed on the device in the same order. Yeah, nothing much more to say about that. That's pretty easy to understand, I guess. In the content management, same as for Android, we have the option to enable the content box, which is then installed on the device and allows the device to access the data in the content box. Otherwise, most things we already talked about in Android, or talked about now. And now I will jump to a Windows device, and as before, I will mainly point out the big differences here. Otherwise, most sections should be already known. beginning with the device overview, where I just see a bit of basic overview over the device. We talked about that. In the settings tab, I have the option to automatically update the operating system, same as we talked before in the other operating systems. We have the asset management, where we see a lot of information about the device if we need any detailed information, same as we talked about before. Anti-theft, same thing. It's password protected and I see where the device was. In my case, again, a dummy device, so I don't have real GPS data. And of course, I can control if I even want to record GPS data and how often I want to do that. Security configuration, same thing. Password restriction settings can be set here, so the device has a passcode and the device passcode is not 12345. Can be configured here, same thing. Now we come to something that's, for one, Windows specific, and therefore nothing we talked about in that way about in other operating systems. First of all, we can configure the antivirus, the Windows Defender, which is implemented in Windows itself. This gives you just the basic information or the general configuration of Windows Defender you already know from Windows itself. So if you already looked into Windows, into the Defender settings, you can find almost all the info or all the same settings here as well. So you can define how often it should scan, what type of scan it should be, what it should scan or even not scan. So that's basically a representation of the configuration you usually have on the device itself, on the Windows device itself, to configure the Defender, but in this case in an MDM, so you can configure it for 100 or 1000 devices at a time. You can also configure the security center, which basically is just are just options what the user can see. So depending on how you set it here, the security center shows a lot of information about the UI, or if you disable everything here, it will hide everything. Otherwise, this doesn't do much. So it's basically about visibility on the device locally. And you can configure the internal Windows firewall, same as when talking about the Windows Defender. It's basically a representation of the settings you have in Windows itself to configure the firewall in a general way and define more precise firewall rules here as well. It's basically all the options you know from the Windows firewall. So if you know the Windows firewall, you will instantly recognize all the options here and just define detailed firewall rules, which can be especially interesting if your devices are not always in your internal network, but maybe outside in a mobile network or in a private network. So you have at least some kind of protection with the internal Windows firewall. In the restriction settings, again, we have some restrictions, which pretty much explain themselves. Some of them you may be, or some things you may expect here, but they are on another place. What we will see in a moment. So everything, let's say app related to certain pre-installed apps may not be able here, but in another location, but we will talk about it in a second. Here we have the BitLocker encryption settings, which gives you the option to encrypt the device with BitLocker. Again, this is mainly self-explanatory. If you already worked with BitLocker before and know what BitLocker does, you can enable BitLocker here to require device encryption so the device gets encrypted. But what's a bit special here is that you not only have the normal BitLocker configuration options, you have also the option to define a silent encryption through an extension we implemented. So if you would not use this, or if you normally start a BitLocker encryption, you will have a pop-up. The user will be informed that the device is getting encrypted and maybe has to confirm something or enter a PIN code or something like that. Which, depending on what the device is currently doing, is something that could interrupt his workflow. For example, if he currently holds a presentation and suddenly a BitLocker window pops up, that's nothing you usually want to do. So you can enable the silent encryption to make the whole thing silent. And besides that, you can really define all the different things regarding BitLocker, how it should be encrypted, and pins and everything. Can be defined here manually if you want to go into detail here. I'm not going into detail here because, as said, it's mainly mimicking, or it's mainly a representation of the normal BitLocker settings. But yeah, you can configure BitLocker here in a more detailed way and also check the BitLocker state. In my case, again, it's a dummy device, not really a real device, and therefore there's no real BitLocker status, but I think it's pretty clear what you could see here. If it's already encrypted or if it's currently encrypting, you would see the status and how far it is and a lot of other information. But most importantly, which is the recovery password, or known as recovery key, which can be used under certain circumstances if the user lost the pin or something out of some other things got wrong, to unlock the device. So the recovery key is not available to the users, but instead it's only visible here in the MDM. So the user doesn't know the recovery key, cannot lose it or anything like that, and only you have access to it. And you can also rotate it. In my case, the button is grayed out because I currently, like I said, dummy device doesn't have it. But if you would have a recovery password here, you could also rotate it. So this means if the recovery key is used and the device unlocks and connects to the server, a new recovery key is generated and sent to the server, and you will see it here. So for example, if a user needs a recovery key and maybe he's not close to you, maybe he's in another country, you have to send him the private key in any way. He can use it, and should he, for some reason, should anyone else get access to this recovery key due to some security problems or because the user wrote it on a piece of paper, the recovery key would become useless in the moment he uses it, because as said, the device gets unlocked, boots normally, connects to the server, and in this moment the recovery key will be switched out, and the recovery key you just sent to the user will become invalid and therefore useless for anyone who gets it. And if the user needs another recovery key again, you would see it here and it will be a new one. Certificate management, same thing we already talked about, the option to define or upload trusted and identity certificates. We already talked about that in the other operating systems. Connection management, same thing we already talked about, the option to set up a Wi-Fi and VPN in detail, so it's available to the user on the device. PIN management, same thing here. You can define an Exchange account and configure server hostname, email address, and everything you need to have an Exchange account running on the device. We talked about that already on the other operating systems. Same logic here. In the app management, we have the installed apps and the mandatory apps. We have the option here to distribute different apps on different ways. Of course, Windows is in this regarding apps a bit special compared to iOS and Android, because of course on iOS and Android you have this the public normal implemented stores of the operating systems, which is the go-to way to get apps. On Windows and iOS, most of your apps and most people find all their apps in the store, and there are ways for us to distribute the apps over the store, which we already talked about for iOS and Android. But of course, Windows is a bit special when coming to the store, because of course Windows has a store, but everyone is aware that not everything can be found inside the store, just because Windows has such a big history, but the Windows Store itself is pretty young compared to the whole history of Windows. Therefore, not everything can be found in store. But there are different ways to distribute apps. One thing is, of course, to search the store for whatever app you like and add it this way. Otherwise, you have the option to upload apps yourself. This can be done either as an MSI or as an AppTec360 or AppTec360 bundle. This is something you can do. So you have, like I said, MSI, AppTec360, and another thing is the Win32 deployment, where you can upload exe files. This is a bit more complicated, and to don't go into much detail, but just to show this once and talk about this for a second, I will quickly jump into the general settings again in the in-house app database, where we have the Windows 10 sections. As said, we have the option to upload AppTec360 and AppTec360 bundle. We have the option to upload MSI. Both can be connected to optional packages and dependencies. I didn't do that in my case, but you can do that if you need that for your packages. And you have the option to upload exe files here as well. As you maybe already know, MSI and AppTec360 files are pretty basic and simple to install, while .exe files usually come with some kind of an installer. And maybe you want to give certain parameters or certain requirements, and this can all be managed here. So if I click on the plus, I can upload a new file here and define all the parameters. I just go quickly through here because otherwise we could, if we go into every detail, we could talk a lot about this, but I can give this a name, description, upload a package file. This is important. This has to be a zip file which contains your exe file, and maybe, if required, any other optional file. Depending on the program you want to deliver or distribute, there maybe need to be additional files within the zip file. You can select a deployment context, which is basically interesting, or basically defines if the system has access to certain system paths or to use certain user paths. So for example, if a program installs itself into app data, you have to configure it here as deployment context user. With deployment context system, it will not be able to resolve system variables like username or something like that. So in most cases, you're high likely going to use user, but this depends on the program you use, and you have to know what it does and what it needs to access, and maybe just try around. In the install command, this defines the install command, what should be run to install the device relative to the path inside the zip file, which is also explained here. So this is mainly interesting if you want to provide certain parameters. So for example, I have 7zip setup.exe and I say it should run /silent. This of course is something you have to know what you can define here and what the setup supports as different parameters, but they can be used here. And the uninstall command would be the path to the uninstaller. Otherwise, you can also define certain things. If an app should be closed for the install to work, because of course, if you if you have certain dependencies, maybe your package needs to close every browser or the Firefox to be installed. You can define which program should be closed and how it should be closed. You can also define reboot configuration, so the device reboots automatically after the installation has been finished. You can also define requirements. So if you configure these requirements and, for example, you have 100 devices, you set the app to distribute on these 100 devices. The requirements will be checked again, and only devices within these 100 within this group which also fit the requirement will install this app. So for example, if I say it should only be installed on 32-bit systems, it will not be installed on 64-bit systems. And I can also define other requirements and can also define detection rules where I can simply provide a path or can define a PowerShell script which just checks whether or not the program is already installed. So for example, usual way to go would be to define a detection rule which just checks if the main application file within the usual path is present. And if this file is present, the app will not be installed. This also depends high likely on the program and how it works. But that's the general idea of providing or distributing exe files. You can upload them here, define all this kind of parameter, and afterwards within your profile you can enable it and select your packet and that it should be installed, and then it will be installed depending on these different requirements and configurations you just set. In the restrictions and settings, we have the option to allow or disallow all the different system apps we have. So if you want to disallow any app on the device, for example, the Xbox app or the store app or Skype or whatever you want, you can just disable it here. There's a lot of them, so there should be most of them usually here. Otherwise, if you want to block something that's on the device which cannot be found here, it can be blocked with the black and white listing here. Same thing as on the other operating systems with black and white listing. Here in Enterprise Data Protection, you can configure the Windows Information Protection of Windows itself. If you already know what Windows Information Protection is, that's basically that. You can define this here to configure Windows Information Protection to keep your files secure. So there's nothing wrong happening with your work files. You can define all the parameters you usually do for Windows information protection here. So same thing as for some other things. It just is a representation of the Windows information protection settings you can define here. Kiosk mode, we already talked about that. I have the option to define a single or multi-app kiosk mode. We talked about that on the other operating system. It's limiting the device to one single app or to multiple apps, and I can define all the different things here. But yeah, that's the general overview over Windows. And another small thing before we end, I want to click on this icon on the top left, which brings me to the reporting. Just by seeing this, you should already get an idea what this is about. The reporting basically lists all the different informations we have and gives you a lot of different lists, a lot of different information, and all these lists and views can be changed by you. You can change which columns to display, what to filter for, what to sort it, however you want to sort it. You can change what diagram is displayed here. You can download the file as a CSV, you can download the list as a CSV file. So there's a lot of things. So if you look for any kind of list, so for example, if you say I want to have every device listed based on their, I don't know, Android version, you could do that here. You can get lists which apps are installed, how often a certain version is installed. So you see there's a lot of information you can get here. I'm not going into detail here, but I think the idea is very clear. Because again, this is pretty much self-explanatory. You have different categories and you can change them yourself. Like I said, if you need any kind of information, any kind of list, you will definitely find it here in the reporting. And that's basically all there is to say about the system in general, about Android, iOS, Windows, about the reporting. That should basically give you a good idea about what the system is capable of, where you can find certain things, how certain things work, or what you need to know. For example, about Android Enterprise or APNS certificate and stuff like that. And this should give you a very good idea. And that's it for this video. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and have a nice day.